Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. Like Andrew told you, my name is Morgan Davis. I'm the Senior Archivist here at the Robert J. Dole Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our inaugural Dole Archives Visiting Fellow, Mr. Richard Baker. Mr. Baker served as the first historian of the U.S. Senate, beginning with the establishment of the Senate Historical Office in 1975, and continuing in that position until 2009. During his career, Mr. Baker served under 9 Senate Majority Leaders, 5 Democrats, 4 Republicans, one of which was Senator Bob Dole. Mr. Baker and Senator Dole share a history together that began in 1987 when they partnered on a project celebrating the bicentennial of the United States Senate. Beginning on the first day of the 100th Congress, Senator Dole delivered short historical vignettes written by Mr. Baker and his staff highlighting the significant people, unusual customs, and memorable events associated with the Senate over its first 2 centuries. These vignettes became known as the Senate Bicentennial Minutes and were later compiled and published as the Historical Almanac of the United States Senate. Mr. Baker's devotion to history is evident in his work building the Senate Historical Office. As the first director, he made great strides, collecting and maintaining historical records, recording and publishing oral histories, cataloging and preserving photographs that document all aspects of Senate-related activities. Not content to merely preserve history, Mr. Baker worked to make that history more accessible to the American public through rich content presented on the Senate Historical Office website, exhibits in congressional office buildings in the new Capitol Visitor Center, frequent appearances on C-SPAN, and most importantly, a tireless devotion to answering questions from senators, their staffs, reporters, historians, students, and even tourists visiting the halls of Congress for the very first time. What many people do not realize is that the records of Congress, the legislative research, bill drafts, memos, and other files that record how and why legislation comes into being are not subject to any overarching legislation regarding their disposition. A senator is free to keep, dispose of, or make publicly available those records at his or her discretion. We are lucky that Senator Dole chose early in his career to preserve his congressional archive intact and make that archive available to the public here at the Dole Institute of Politics. It is now one of the largest congressional archives in the country and one that I encourage you to visit. A strong belief in the importance of preserving and making history accessible is something that our guest shares with Senator Dole. Tonight we will hear firsthand from Richard some of his great stories about the Senate and his career as the Senate historian as he's interviewed by the director of the Dole Institute, Bill Lacy, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. Please welcome them.
Richard, let's start tonight talking a little bit about you. Give us a bit of your history, how you became the very first historian of the Senate, and what you actually did in that job.
Well, a lot of luck is involved in getting a job like this, but it was because I was the first in the job, very few people knew that there was a Senate Historical Office. There wasn't much competition for the position, but I was hired by the Senate, and I did apply for the job, and a number of other people applied. And they said Senator Mike Mansfield, who was the majority leader, a Republican leader was Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, and they basically said, do what it is that historians do. But this, keep in mind, is in 1975, when the Senate is really feeling a sense of institutional patriotism. It's the end of Watergate. The Senate, the Urban Watergate Committee, and with some help from the House side, basically brought a president down, and the Senate reasserted some of its constitutional investigative powers. They passed the War Powers Resolution and also the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And so Mike Mansfield said, "Why should we don't know enough about our history. We ought to have a historical program." And Hugh Scott, who also, like Mike Mansfield, had a graduate degree, graduate training in history, they were the ideal majority and minority leader to bring something like this into being. I had previously worked for the Senate for a short period of time in the late 1960s as the acting curator and my job was to help set up a Senate curator's office. Then I went off to work for a brand new company called National Journal as their research director, and 5 years later I got a call from the Hill saying, would you like to throw your hat into the ring for this job? And you better believe it. So I did, and I got the job. And then, we started out with no files, no real information, and yet reporters knew that we existed, and they started calling, asking, how many senators have been convicted of crimes? Who knows? And so what I did was put together a staff, and Morgan Davis's introduction was so gracious, but I have to add that none of this would have been possible without a terrific staff, and we put that together over the years. My associate historian, Don Ritchie, who's now the Senate historian, was one of the backbones of that operation. And we basically went out and introduced ourselves to other government historians. Many people don't know that many government agencies employ historians, the military certainly, and the State Department, and other agencies. So we went out to find out what it is historians are supposed to do. And we quickly learned that our responsibility was not so much to keep up on the history of environmental legislation in the Senate, or you name the subject. But that's what the Congressional Research Service at the Library of Congress, with a staff of 800 experts, does. They're there to provide that kind of assistance to Congress. Our focus was really, we realized very quickly, on the institutional history of the Senate. Has the Senate always been like it is today, was sort of the question. What has been the career path of senators? How many senators have served for 20 or 30 or 40 years? And nobody really knew that. I mean, it was knowable, but the information was all kind of scattered. And so we went to work and began to compile a database. And the one that I'm the proudest of, and one that was the most demanding, was a very simple one. Namely, the biographical information of all the people who've ever served in the Senate and the House of Representatives. For years, Congress published something called the Biographical Directory of the American Congress. And so it fell to our office to update the Senate information there. But that only took you just a little way down the road in terms of finding information. How many books have been written about a particular senator? What is the location of that senator's office papers, personal files? And all of that was really very difficult for researchers to find out. So we set to work with armies of interns over a period of about 10, 12 years, going over to the card catalog at the Library of Congress across the street and writing down the titles of books by and about individual senators. And now have put that all into a large database called bioguide.gov that anybody who has internet access can find out. And it just saves researchers enormous amounts of time. If you're doing a book on the New Deal, and you've got, say, 10 or 12 senators from the New Deal that you want to look at with great detail, there it is. It saves you a lot of time and trouble. You still have to go visit the repositories of their papers, but you're off and running.
We're going to start with a couple of specific questions about Bob Dole and then really focus on the institution. But sure. My next question is just very simply, what are some of your favorite memories about Senator Dole?
Well, one involves a lunch that he invited me and my good staff to in 1989, and it is related to the Historical Almanac of the United States Senate. We'd been working with him on that, and it's true that we drafted a lot of the text, but we also got a lot of feedback from him about things that he would like to do a little differently. I mean, he put his imprint on that book in a direct way. And so at the end of the project, he said, I am so grateful for your help. If I can ever find you any office space, it's not if you need more funds for your staff, it's office space. That was the currency of the time. And that would be the nicest thing he could do, because we were kind of cramped into a small office, and we didn't take him up on that. But the other thing he did was invite us all to lunch. And it was a very special lunch catered in the majority leaders, in the Republican leaders' suite of the Capitol. And there was nothing rushed about it. We had plenty of time to chat with him and so forth. And that was sort of a high point in our relationship, but then it continued. One of my all-time favorite moments in the Senate chamber was in 1996 when he gave his farewell address. And I was fortunate enough to be sitting right behind Mrs. Dole in the gallery. I think that the applause after his speech probably went on for a good 10 to 12 minutes. People hadn't quite heard something like that, and it was so filled with quotable observations about the Senate from his experience going back to 1969. So you had the sense that we're back to the Senate of the classical days. When you hear a speech from the heart like that, that was terrific.
Well, as you know, he resigned from the Senate in '96. He's been out of the Senate now for 14 years. What do you think his legacy as a senator will be?
Well, certainly his legacy as a leader of the Senate is one of civility. The balanced budget amendment of 1995. He spent a great deal of time rounding up votes, Republican votes, and he joked at one point that some people go to sleep by counting sheep. He goes to sleep by counting senators. Tell me, how many, does he have 51? Does he have 60 for cloture? But on that one, Mark Hatfield, Senator Republican from Oregon, said, I'm going to have to vote against the party's position on passing this legislation. And Senator Dole was, all accounts, very, very upset about that. Mark Hatfield said, look, I'll tell you what, I've got to vote my conscience on this, but I'll resign from the Senate. And if I resign from the Senate, then you'll have just the right number to pass it, the two-thirds vote necessary. And Senator Dole said, no, that's extreme. And he had great respect for Mark Hatfield and for the integrity behind his position. So although politically it was the worst thing that could have happened, there was this sense of great respect for a fellow senator, and I understand that's you go the way you have to go, and that was it. And so,
how did going to the institution? How did the founders kind of define and structure the role of the U.S. Senate?
Well, they. Leading into the framing of the writing of the Constitution, of course, we had the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation had a one-chambered Congress called the Congress of the Confederation. And that was notorious. It had very little power, and it didn't get very much done. And so the framers said we've got to have two chambers, one kind of check on the other. It's the whole sense of balancing of power. It's where the story about the teacup comes from. Thomas Jefferson was it was in Paris at the time that the Constitution was being written. We don't know if this is really a true story, but it ought to be if it isn't. He came back and asked George Washington, why did you create two chambers? When we had one, we're getting along fine with one. And Washington supposedly said, you just answered the question, because you just poured your hot tea from the cup into the saucer to cool it. And that's why we created a Senate, to have as another senator later on said, it's a place for sober second thought. Sometimes the second thought gets to be third thought and fourth thought and fifth thought and very sober, but it's a place for reflection. And it was modeled pretty much after two state senates, the state Senate of Maryland and the state Senate of Massachusetts. And the original senators were elected not by the people, but by their state legislatures. So they were, in effect, the elect of the elect. But then they go off to the capital city, which initially was in New York and then in Philadelphia until 1800, and they're meeting behind closed doors for the first 5 or 6 years, because the Continental Congress met behind closed doors. Why shouldn't, the big innovation was that the House of Representatives would hold its sessions in public, but the Senate just went ahead and met in secret. But then these state legislators who elected individual senators said, well, how do we know what you're saying up there? And all we see is your vote. And we told you to vote against Jay's treaty in 1794, 1795, and you voted for it. What's going on here? And the senator would say, well, you know, I got up, I talked to my colleagues, I learned more about the subject, and I kind of, you know, changed my mind. And the state legislature, and this is, of course, the classic dilemma of any elected official. Do you vote your constituency or do you vote your conscience? And some of those state legislatures said, we think of you as an ambassador to the national government, and we gave you your instructions, and if you can't follow the instructions, then you should do what any decent, self-respecting ambassador would do and resign. And the senators would, and some did. But others said, sorry, we have the 6-year term. There's no provision in the Constitution to recall us, so thank you very much, we'll stay there. So that is a certain amount of independence developed very, very quickly. And needless to say, the Senate, with a lot of pressure from the public, eventually opened its doors in 1795. And there was a big rush into the galleries. They couldn't open the doors until they built the gallery in the Senate chamber in Philadelphia. They finally took them 9 months to do that. People wanted to see what was going on in this chamber. And after about a day, they said, well, what a boring thing, you know, there's just, you know, 14 to 15 people sitting around and, you know, very deliberate. And we're going back down to where the action is, one floor below in the building that's Congress Hall today in Philadelphia, where you've got over 100 House members, you know, grabbing fire tongs and, you know, chasing each other around the room. It was a lot more exciting.
Well, historically, there's been some egregiously bad behavior on the floor of the Senate, and I know one particular episode actually was triggered by an incident in Lawrence, Kansas, prior to the Civil War.
That's right. So, it's a big day for us in terms of the historical calendar. May 22nd, 1856, the day after the so-called sack of Lawrence, where Southern a posse led by pro-slavery people invaded the Lawrence and burned a building, and one person died as a result. I think they burned several buildings, and it was quite a. It came at a time where Kansas was the focal point of the question of how do we decide whether a state is going to enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. And, you know, not to go into the history of it too much, but the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had it pretty much worked out that states would come in slave state, free state pairs, and then Stephen Douglas came up with the idea of popular sovereignty in 1854, and so now we let the people of the area decide, and so the result, as this audience knows, is Bleeding Kansas. And Charles Sumner stood up on the floor of the Senate on the 22nd of May, 1856, and gave a very long speech in which he attacked Stephen Douglas for his supporting popular sovereignty and made some very tough remarks about other senators. That triggered an assault on Sumner several days later by a House member who was related to one of the senators who had been verbally attacked. And Preston Brooks came into the Senate chamber, sat there, didn't want to offend the dignity of the Senate, so he waited till they adjourned about quarter of 1 in the afternoon, and wasn't too crowded agenda that particular day. And then he marched down the aisle and then walked up to Charles Sumner, who was bent over his desk signing a signature as a postal frank in the upper right-hand corner of envelopes so that he could mail the very speech, the crime against Kansas speech that he'd made a few days earlier. And that, as Sumner was signing that, Preston Brooks brought he had a cane with a solid gold handle, brought it down on Charles Sumner's head, and for about a minute, and other senators kind of stood back and either thought Sumner deserved what he was getting or just were shocked. And Sumner fell to the floor, bleeding profusely, carried out of the room, and they thought he would die. He stayed away from the Senate for most of the next 3 years. His empty desk became a tourist attraction in the old Senate chamber. And the Senate at that point considered creating a rule saying this is not proper behavior for a senator. But then they thought, no, we shouldn't have to write that kind of thing down. This is gentlemen know what proper behavior is, and we would be insulting gentlemen to do it. So then 50 years later, just to jump ahead a little bit, there was another incident in the Senate chamber where two South Carolina senators got into a verbal tussle, and then it resulted in one of them punching his colleague in the mouth in the Senate chamber. Well, then the chairs fell over and the desk got knocked over and people are flying all over the Senate chamber. 1902. The Senate reprimanded both members, censured them, got them to apologize, but they apologized in such a sarcastic manner that the Senate said, all right, we're going to suspend you as a senator for a few days, and we're going to pass this rule, which today is known as Rule 19. And Rule 19, what they thought about passing at the time of the Sumner caning in 1856, they finally passed in 1902, and we hear about Rule 19 all the time in the modern Senate. And what it says is that a senator shall not speak ill of a fellow senator. And if he does, or she does, they will be required to sit down, because they'll be considered, this great term, out of order, and until a ruling can be made. So, but yeah, that was a huge step forward in helping redefining the norms of civility in the Senate chamber.
Well, following on to that, Richard, what are some of the foundations and supports of civility in the United States Senate?
Well, one of the major foundations is that it's a small body, and you very quickly get to know your fellow senators. Over the years, until the invention of the coast-to-coast transcontinental jet airplane, senators used to spend a great deal of time playing cards on the weekend. Back in the particularly prior to the end of World War II, throughout the 19th century, they'd be in Washington for maybe 3 blocks of time per year. And then they'd go home for the holiday. It's a long train ride across the country, and they'd be gone for a month, and then they'd come back. And they'd live with each other in many cases. They really get to know each other. So that was a basic prop in favor of civility. And there was not any real sense of I'm a Whig, you're a Democrat, or I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat. It was a sense that we're brother senators, and we need to work together. Even today, the leadership of the Senate, and Senator Dole was involved in this, organizes evening events for senators and their spouses at the Smithsonian, the National Archives, just to get away from the office and see each other in a setting where they kind of relax a little bit. But the airplane has made it possible for senators not to spend a lot of time on the Hill when the Congress is not in session, and that has weakened the civility.
Okay. Many Americans are justifiably concerned about the lack of civility and bipartisanship in the Senate. But, based on some of the stories you've told us previously, how would you say this period of time stacks up historically?
Right now?
Yes.
This period right now? Not good. How about that for a 2-word answer? But then you can sit around the table with a group of congressional historians and immediately come up with a long list of other bad times. When things are not going well for the nation, it's reflected on the floors of Congress, and I think even more so in the United States Senate. Huge problems and a lot at stake, and it is. But I think this is. I would not deny that we're in a uniquely low point in the cycle. But I am a firm believer that the pendulum will, as it has done in the past, will swing away from this low point.
So your sense is that at some point things will start to improve. There will be more bipartisanship, civility, comedy, all those things.
Well, and I always like to say that historians shouldn't predict the future. We can't even talk about the past terribly effectively. But I think the answer lies with the American people. They have a good ability, in the past at least, to make self-corrections and to send, maybe adjust the kind of people they're sending to the Senate. Maybe, hard for me to say this, but maybe people who are less bitterly partisan than may be the case in recent times. The Senate doesn't reform itself. The American people have reformed the Senate. And maybe I could just mention, there are a couple of examples. One I mentioned earlier, the fact that senators were elected by state legislatures. And was that ever a breeding ground for bribery and corruption, because you only had a few people to bribe, and you only needed to get half of those people bribed, and then you had the election. And so from as early as 1824, there were proposals to amend the Constitution to change the Senate, the way the senators were elected. A lot of public anger about that, a lot of political cartoons. It took from 1824 until 1913 to amend the Constitution. And that only happened because of very strong popular pressure. The House of Representatives voted to change it, in the late 1890s, but the Senate, for some complex reasons, took its time. But it was public pressure that made a difference.
How important, I've had Senator Dole talk, and we've talked about his career here in our presidential lecture series this month, but about the importance of working closely with the leader of the other party. How important is that in terms of maintaining a sense of civility and even cooperation and the possibility, at least, of bipartisanship and compromise?
It's vital, absolutely vital. And the one party leader knows what a thankless job the other party leader has, and sympathizes. So it's crucial. And through most of the 20th century, the party leaders have worked pretty well together. There's a story that Senator Tom Daschle tells when he was the Democratic leader of the Senate, that he'd just become the Democratic leader in the mid-1990s, and lo and behold, here comes Bob Dole to have a meeting with Tom Daschle in Daschle's office. And at the time, this was 1995, Senator Dole was the majority leader of the Senate, and Daschle's just the new guy on the block, and he isn't that nice that the majority leader's guy, I'm so flattered and so forth, he's spending his time with me. But then he realized what Senator Dole was up to. I mean, indeed, it was genuine and so forth, but he said, but by him coming to my office, he also he has the power to end the meeting when he wants to end the meeting, and then he can get up and walk out. But they had a very, very good relationship, sort of a model relationship. I should say the Senate organized a series of speeches in the late 1990s and early 2000 called the Leaders Lecture Series. And it's the transcripts and the streaming video are on the Senate website. Senator Dole gave his speech to that series. He'd been out of the Senate for 4 years, and it was 10 years ago this month. And I reread it the other day, and it's filled with insights about what it means to be a leader of the Senate. And the nice thing, there were 9 leaders, including former vice presidents who came and spoke. And each one of them, as they prepared their remarks, went through the speeches of the previous leaders. And this was done over a period of about 3 years. So they're kind of, in a way, they're kind of commenting about each other's view of leadership in the Senate. And it's a terrific work on leadership, and it's available on the internet.
Was it fairly common, I know Senator Dole had this agreement, but was it fairly common for the leaders of the two separate parties to make deals not to surprise each other on things, and so that would allow them to go out and be partisan in a very aggressive way, but at the same time kind of let their colleague know, hey, this is coming down the pike? That's
right. And Senator Howard Baker, when he became the majority leader in 1981, after the great surprise that the Republicans took control of the Senate in the election of 1980. No one saw that coming. I remember where I was when I heard it. And all of a sudden, it's open under new management, as the chief deputy to Howard Baker joked. But Howard Baker walked up to Robert Byrd, the Democratic leader, who was pretty upset about losing the majority, and he said, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal. I will never surprise you if you don't ever surprise me. And Senator Byrd thought about it for a minute and said, that's a pretty good basis for operation. And then when Senator Dole became the leader, a couple of years later, they extended that agreement between Senator Byrd and Senator Dole in 1985. And so it's essential. And if the relations between the two leaders are not good, then everybody's in trouble.
What's the relationship between Majority Leader Reid and Republican Leader McConnell?
Well, you would expect that it's it would be tense, and if you read the newspaper articles and so forth. But 2 years ago, Senator Reid did something that was rather significant, at least in the mind of Senator McConnell. At the University of Louisville, there is a Mitch McConnell Center for the Study of Public Policy, and they had an unveiling there, and so Senator Reid interrupted his other duties, got on an airplane, flew to Louisville, and attended that event in an otherwise enormously busy time. And Senator McConnell, I think I have good reason to know, never forgot that. And even though things get a little testy between the two of them on the floor, beneath it all, there is this sense that we're brothers in this battle. And there was a time where you draw the line and say, we're not going to cross that line, because if we do, the consequences for civility and for just the basic operational structure of the Senate are going to be pretty grave. And sometimes the tide washes awfully close to that line, but it's part of the glue that keeps things going.
Mm-hmm. The number of women senators has increased dramatically over the years. Give us a little bit of the sense of history of that. Women had no place in the Senate at all, other than supporting their husbands, until 1922, and actually that was tokenism at its extreme level, when there was a vacancy in a Georgia Senate seat. The governor of Georgia had wanted to endear himself to the newly enfranchised women voters of Georgia, and so he appointed an 87-year-old woman named Rebecca Felton to what turned out to be a one-day gig in the Senate from Georgia. And she came in and she made a wonderful speech. She said, today our numbers may be few, but before long our numbers will increase, and you will get dedication and loyal service and so forth. But then it took until 1932 for the first woman to be actually elected as opposed to appointed. And then a long haul. Margaret Chase Smith of Maine was the first woman to have served in the House that came over to the Senate in 1949. But when she retired from the Senate, or was actually defeated in the election of 1972, no women in the Senate. And from 1973 until 1978, when a couple of senators were appointed, because the case of Hubert Humphreys, Muriel Humphrey, Hubert Humphrey died, so she was appointed to fill out the seat and so forth. But now we come to the current situation where there are 17 women. There have only been about 34 women in all who have ever served in the Senate, and half of them are serving there now. And I will take a pretty good bet that that will never, probably never drop below 17, and hopefully, and that's about the proportion in the House of Representatives of women, about 17%. But then you look at the state legislatures, and women have a much greater role in state legislatures. And that kind of filters its way over to the Senate, and hopefully the numbers will be a little more balanced. One of the great changes that's occurred over the years in the Senate is the televising of what's going on the floor by C-SPAN. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of give us your assessment of the pros and cons of that?
That's a tough question. It's not as simple black or white for sure. The House of Representatives decided to televise its proceedings from gavel to gavel in 1979. A number of senators said, "See, that proves our point. The House is going to do it. We want nothing to do with it." Because in the House, members only get to speak for 1 minute or maybe 5 minutes in extraordinary circumstances. In the Senate, once a senator has the floor, he or she can speak as long as they can stand up. And so it's not for us. And so the Senate agonized from 1979 until 1986, when finally the pressure again from the public, what are you trying to hide? It's like the state legislators putting pressure on those first senators meeting behind closed doors. What's the secret here? And so the Senate finally opened its proceedings to C-SPAN. And all of a sudden, the Senate chamber started looking more attractive. They got a new carpet in there. It was a baby blue washed out carpet. And then the senators would complain that on C-SPAN, they didn't look too good, particularly the junior senators who sit up in the back row. It looked like they were standing in a bus station. There was nothing behind them other than this beige wall. And so next, almost miraculously, these damask patterned wall coverings appear in the Senate chamber. And even today, a freshman senator sitting up in the back row who's going to make her or his maiden speech, first speech, takes the trouble to make sure to borrow a desk location so that the damask pattern will be framing that person on television perfectly. So they pay good attention to it, for sure. And C-SPAN has certainly made, and the televising of Senate proceedings has made for a much more informed public. And you talk to any congressional staffer who has to answer letters or emails from the public who have been following in great detail the health care debate, for instance, on C-SPAN. But what does this do? Does this mean we end up with a lot of showboat senators who go out there and kind of, particularly if they're up for a re-election or grab the camera late in the afternoon? There's a little bit of that. It certainly has revolutionized the use of charts in the chamber. There's a special division now that manufactures charts, and they have to, by regulation, they can only be so big. But you bring them in there, and you see some poor staffer dragging them over from the office building to the Capitol and putting them up on an easel, and then just so the senator can make a point. Has television profoundly changed the Senate? I don't know. I can't imagine the Senate without television coverage. But whether you take those cameras into every committee room, C-SPAN has been doing that for a long time, but do you take it into every private meeting between two senators trying to work out something? Of course not. It will just force the discussion off campus somewhere. But you've got to have some privacy just to have some of those preliminary discussions.
Following along that question, what's been the effect of new media, of blogs, of all the additional information that's out there for everyone to read on a daily basis? How has that affected the Senate?
Well, I suspect it's affected individual senators in a major way. I think back to the days say prior to the 1960s, when a senator could come to Washington and be an expert on whatever it is he wanted to, or she wanted to be an expert on. And they would choose committees based on their state's constituency interests. And that was it. They didn't have to be an expert on A to Z, every subject across the horizon. Now, with 24/7 news coverage, with bloggers, with the corridors of the Capitol filled with people standing there with microphones and tape recorders, you better have a view on just about everything. And I would think, you have to ask a senator what they think, but it's very fragmenting. It's so hard it's like they say it's like drinking from a fire hose. There's just so much coming at a senator. And we hear senators who have been previously House members with smaller staffs and smaller constituencies who could kind of grab on to the issues a little bit more. And House members serve on fewer committees, so their attention isn't fragmented. But boy, you get into the United States Senate, and fragmentation is the order of the day. And you have to hope, as a senator, that you're able to hire and retain good staff members. It would be impossible to do the job today without a good staff.
How has the growth and the importance and the fees paid to lobbyists affected the functioning of the United States Senate?
Well, we read recently in the paper that Toyota normally has 34 lobbyists on Capitol Hill, and they're bringing in some extras for the current unpleasantness, and it may be as many as 50 lobbyists. So everybody's trying to grab the attention of senators. And it doesn't matter whether you're a senior senator or a junior senator, you're in the spotlight. But then at the same point, you need money to run your reelection campaign. And the cost of the campaigns, of course, vary according to the size of the state and the media markets that cover that state. But it's not unusual to spend $10 million for a campaign every 6 years, or $20 million. Or John Corzine, when he ran in New Jersey, spent $63 million. Hillary Clinton spent $30 million. How do you get that kind of money? You figure that out in terms of how much you have to raise per day, and it's thousands of dollars per day. How do you do that and still keep your sanity? I don't know. It is. Maybe we need to go back to the days when senators were elected by state legislatures. Then they have to spread all this time and money around. But it's a real issue of major concern.
We're in a period today that is arguably one of the most polarized in terms of politics, and that affects the Senate. What do you see as the principal causes of that?
That's the big question. It is the major question. Certainly, the fact is that the nation is polarized, and the senators are a reflection of the nation. And the nation is heavily engaged in the Middle East. There are huge deficits, major issues with the quality of education the average American student gets. Health care, of course, is one of the number one issues on the list. Labor, all these problems seem to be, there are always problems facing Congress, and they always, at the time, they always seem like they're huge problems. But boy, we've got a bushel basket full right now. And with all of the bloggers and the media outlets and the commentators fanning the flames. I mean, that's a negative way to say it, fanning the flames. The positive way is they're educating the public, so they can make more. But from a point of view of a senator who's being deluged with attack ads, it's fanning the flames. So but it starts with the public. And then the Senate is almost, and the House of Representatives too, it's sort of an echo chamber for this, and we just see it writ large in the Senate.
I just have one more question, and then we're going to open it up to your Q&A. So be thinking about your questions, and I think our students are ready with our cordless microphones. During both the Reagan and the Clinton administrations, there was a lot of bipartisan work. President Reagan would have never gotten his tax cuts and his spending cuts through without Democratic support. President Clinton would have never balanced the budget or gotten welfare reform without Republican support. What's it going to take for us to get back to a period when Republicans and Democrats can work together and can agree on some fundamental things?
I just hope it's not a major national crisis of the size of the 9/11 attacks or of, the budget deficits. What are we going to do about that? I mean, if that doesn't provide the incentive for either getting things together in Congress or for other people decide, I'm going to run for Congress, because I don't think the way my members is representing our state is very effective. But that's a complicated process. And again, as the historian, I'm going to take a refuge in the past because the future is pretty uncertain and a little daunting at this point.
Okay, very good. We're going to open it up to your questions now. We'll go from side to side unless all the questions are on one side, but let's start with a question for Richard Baker. We have one right here, if we can get a microphone up here. Do wait for the microphones, please.
What's the history of the cloture rule in the Senate?
That's is that the $64,000 question? And I restrain myself from giving you an extended answer because one could, for sure. One of the big questions is, when was the first filibuster in the Senate? And I think the first filibuster took place about a week after they arrived and convened in New York in 1789, when one of the issues was, where's the permanent capital of the United States going to be located? And some people who were favoring Philadelphia or favoring Harrisburg, Pennsylvania over Philadelphia hadn't arrived yet. And so the partisans of Harrisburg in the Senate said, we'll just delay the discussion until these guys' horses managed, or stagecoaches managed to bring them here. But the Senate, the very first rules of the Senate did have a rule that could cut off debate, but the Senate never used that rule, and eventually they just wiped it out. And senators prided themselves on being different than the House of Representatives. Fewer senators, if you only have 14 or 15 or 20 or 30 or even 40 in the chamber at one time, everybody pretty much has a chance to speak and feel better about, kind of getting it off their chest. But when it came to World War I, and all of a sudden there's a major national emergency, and Woodrow Wilson wanted to arm merchant ships, and a small group of, or a little group of willful men, as he described them, blocked a vote on that. Then the Senate finally, rallied itself with a lot, again, this point about public pressure, rallied itself to create the first cloture rule in 1917, to close off debate. The House had been closing off debate ever since 1811, but the Senate, 1917, they're finally getting around to it. And so they passed the rule, and it says that in order to cut off debate, you have to have 67 senators voting to do that. But then every senator gets to speak for 1 hour after the vote. So that's, there were almost 100 senators at that point, and then it went from there. The telling fact is that from 1917 until 1962, cloture was successfully invoked only 4 times. It was tried many times. It was particularly tried against Southern senators who were trying to block civil rights legislation. And then we all, some of us remember the day in 1964 when the Senate for the first time invoked cloture on a civil rights bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, with some major help from Everett Dirksen, among others, on the Republican side. But then the story gets a little murky in that Mike Mansfield, as majority leader of the Senate, said, we cannot be having these round-the-clock filibusters, where they move the cots in, and the whole idea of a filibuster is for the opposition to talk and talk and talk so that the majority can't call for a vote and pass the legislation. So Mike Mansfield said, we're going to have to, this happened sort of gradually in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, we're going to have to do this on 2 tracks. So that people who want to talk, can do that, but they have to do it at night or in the non-prime period. And we have to get the business of the country going, particularly in 1974, 1964, talking about the Great Society legislation coming through. But it was really only into the 1980s that we begin to see, instead of long debates on the floor, long-winded debates, the use of cloture. Just, if you don't have the votes to pass legislation, then pull it off the floor, and we'll go on to the next item. And now, of course, the big complaint is there are more cloture votes per Congress now than there have ever been, and nothing is getting done. So then to finish this, should the rules of the Senate be changed to make it easier to invoke cloture, to shut up long-winded senators? And there are some who say it ultimately should be by majority vote. Well, I will sit here and predict today that will never happen, because members of the majority today, remember, we don't have to have a long memory, that a couple of years ago they were playing the same out of the same deck to keep the then majority under control. So it's not going to happen, but it's very frustrating.
I have a question on this side. Okay, question back over here. Got one back here. Andrew or Jen, if you can find this gentleman.
Question on the role of the majority leader of the Senate. Could you talk to us a little bit about that and just kind of how it's such a difficult role and it's destroyed some careers, and how has it never really evolved to allow the majority leader to be more effective? Since the days of Lyndon Johnson, it's kind of gone back to. Could you talk to us a little bit about that? It has,
and if you read Robert Caro's masterful book called Master of the Senate, which really focuses on the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Makes you feel like you're right on the floor. And here's the field general, calling in the troops and getting the votes scheduled just at the right time. There was a big reaction to that among Democratic senators in Johnson's own party, who didn't like to have their arms twisted more than maybe once a year, or two or three times, but not once a day, thank you very much. And of course the Republicans weren't too happy about that. So when Johnson went off to become vice president in 1961, who did the Senate select as a majority leader? Mild-mannered Mike Mansfield, who was the perfect antithesis of Lyndon Johnson. He'd say, let a 100 candles flicker. In terms of the 100 members. Let everybody have their opportunity. Robert Byrd, subsequently, when he became the majority leader, said, oh, I would really like to have the strength of Lyndon Johnson and the understanding and engagement of Mike Mansfield. But it's kind of impossible to do both. It was Howard Baker who said that leading the Senate is like herding cats. And then Trent Lott came out with a book entitled Herding Cats. And it's such a good metaphor, because all these cats, they may go with the same direction for a very limited period of time, but that doesn't last long. And one of the most difficult things for a majority leader is to have a large majority. And we saw this, we've seen it throughout history. All of a sudden you get factions within that majority. It's much better to have a sort of tight 1 or 2 vote margin, and then everybody has to pay attention and be serious. But it's a very, very difficult job, and my hat's off to the people who try to do it.
Questions? We've got a couple back on this side, and then I think we have 1 or 2 right here.
Well, how has the role of the committee staff members changed over the years, and do you think they are able to provide any degree of leadership or cooperation, or are they just followers?
Again, that's a question to which there are multiple answers, I think. But in general, the role of committee staff has greatly expanded. It's a lot of power in being a committee staff member. We're well past the days where a lot of committee staff members were patronage appointees. The amount of money that many of them are responsible for deciding how it's going to be spent is enormous. The Senate Appropriations Committee, just to take one example, the biggest, most powerful committee in the Senate, has about 150 committee staff members, just for one committee. But they're dealing with the budget of the entire government. And you don't want it to be amateur hour. And the turnover within the Appropriations Committee staff, professional staff, is, as I understand it, relatively low because they're experts, and it's pretty hard to replace them. But it hasn't been too long since the committee staff were a little more perhaps. We're not as up to par as that. Although I'm sort of speaking slowly because I'm not sure I really agree with that. I think that there were no professional staff in Congress to speak of until after World War II. And Congress got so frustrated with Franklin Roosevelt calling the shots during World War II. He had all the expertise at his beck and call. Congress had none. And so they passed legislation in 1946 that allowed, for the first time, committees to hire, each committee could hire 4 professional staffers. Well, it's gone a long way since that time. Members could also hire professional staffers because, it's a separated and balanced government. I remember talking not so long ago to members of the House of Commons in Great Britain. They come over and they say, why do they have all these staff members? I as a House of Commons member, have to share a member with another member of the House. And of course, the British government is a unitary government, and we need to check and balance the executive, and particularly at a time of a wildly assertive executive who's usurped enormous amounts of power. Gary Wills has recently written a book on that sort of gives chapter and verse on the subject, and I haven't read the book yet, so I can't say it's the best book on the subject, but he's on to something. It is really, when President Bush issues signing statements, I'll sign this legislation, but I'm going to do it with these reservations. Where's that called for in the Constitution? But in times of national peril and war, presidents have taken on more and more responsibility, and it's not the Senate of the 19th century for sure, or the Congress of the 19th century. It's a constant struggle. One scholar famously said that the Constitution is an invitation to struggle between the branches for power. And boy, that struggle is alive and well today, for sure.
Oh, a couple hands over this way. We have one right here. Pardon me? Oh, okay. I want to get this one next.
Okay.
If you'd speak a little bit to the history of this, everybody has known the Senate as the greatest debating society in the world, and I think it came as somewhat of a shock to Americans when the camera went on. They saw one senator in an empty chamber, speaking with nobody but wielding the gavel. Now, going back in history, when did it begin to depart from the full group really debating?
March 4th, 1909. That is the date that the first Senate office building opened. So senators had real offices and real desks to go to. Prior to 1909, they would greet their constituents literally on the floor of the chamber minutes before the Senate went into session, and they'd have to shoo the constituents out of there. But from that point on, senators would, then they have committee hearings and a lot of other things to do. But then television, to jump ahead a little bit in time, when television became a fact of life in 1986, as a senator, you don't have to be in the chamber. You can just watch it on your television, and if it looks like something's going on that requires you to be in that chamber, you can be there in 3 minutes, at the most 5 minutes. Prior to that time, senators used to have floor watchers before television, who would sit up in the galleries and would run for the telephone anytime something was going on that the senator should know about. But it does make the point that there's so much else going on. Committee hearings are scheduled Tuesday through Thursday, even Monday through Friday. There's a very long list of committee hearings. It is discouraging, for sure.
We have a question right here, Andrew. Right here, this gentleman.
What are your thoughts on bipartisan commissions and being governed by them?
A bipartisan commission they've been used in some very high-profile events in recent years. One of them that I followed for a while was a commission to set congressional salaries. It's too hot a subject for members to debate and vote on themselves, so let's let a commission make a recommendation about proper salaries, and then we'll, from this commission of experts, we'll accept it. And there have been proposals for ethics commissions, maybe made up of bipartisan groups of former members. Well, I can tell you one thing. Current members are not terribly happy to be advised by former members. If you're any good, you'd still be here. We're the ones that are in the line of fire and so forth. And I think that also maybe responds to the larger question that it's convenient for a commission to do that, to study, but that's what congressional committees are for. And that's what congressional committees do all the time. So it depends on the reason for a particular commission being created, and it varies widely. But it is sort of extra-constitutional. It is outside the normal path of how laws how ideas are digested and debated. But it's one source of expertise. And in these complex times, the more the merrier.
Seems like there's a question right back there.
Reconciliation is a big hot topic now, and as I recall, in the 70s, Senator Muskie and others got the congressional budget process passed, and that the first significant time that reconciliation was used was by Senator Baker with the help of a guy named Marty Gould, who decided to pass most of the significant Reagan things under reconciliation. It required a simple majority. And it's been used since then. I wonder if you could comment on that. And at the risk of not breaking the two-question rule, I will make a comment and then you can comment or not on that. And that is, I think in recent years, the senator probably who is most interested in the history generally and of the Senate probably is Robert C. Byrd, and I suspect that he has given you a lot of support over the years.
We've worked a lot with Senator Byrd over the years, for sure, and his interest in history is typical of, well, his interest in history of the Senate is unsurpassed by any other member, for sure, but it is typical of leaders who all of a sudden they're not just journeyman senators, they're not regular senators, they have to look and have the broader perspective, and they often turn to history of the Senate to try to get a sense of all that. The reconciliation, you mentioned Martin Gold, who is, a couple of years ago wrote a book on Senate procedure. And you have to really care about the subject of Senate procedure, but he is the master. He really is a very bright guy who's taken on some tough assignments to figure all that out. And Howard Baker was lucky to have him. And he basically turned reconciliation on its head. The reason for reconciliation was to reconcile differences between expenditures and tax receipts, and it was a minor matter to be done a couple of times during the budget cycle, and no one intended it to be used as a way to get around the 60-vote majority to pass major controversial legislation. The Republicans used it quite a bit in the 1980s. The Democrats haven't been shy about using it either. It is, so the rest of this Congress may be defined by how successful they are in making reconciliation work with regard to health care. But it's the whole business of how how a new senator comes into the chamber and tries to figure out how you survive in that environment. How do you get your will imposed on the other 99 senators? You need some very seasoned staff, and like Martin Gold, and the Democrats have their counterparts as well. And it's not something that's learned quickly or overnight, for sure.
Another question right here, if we can get a microphone here.
Have there been many times when the Senate chaplain has made a remarkable difference? And if so, when?
Well, the nature of a chaplain's job is kind of private. I know when Senator Byrd's 16-year-old grandson was killed in an automobile accident in 1982, the Senate chaplain was according to Senator Byrd's telling, of incalculable personal comfort. And the chaplain considers the whole Senate, including the staff, as to be his flock. And but I think it's pretty much on a personal basis. They lead the Senate with a prayer every day, and then they're there to counsel and be available.
I know we have another question right here. Try not to step in front of the camera.
In the concern for bipartisanship, has the Senate ever entertained the idea of trying to seat people in some way other than left-hand side versus right-hand side? It would seem to me that it might be interesting if so-and-so sat next to so-and-so, whether they agreed with them far down the line or not. Just arrange them by Social Security number, weight, or charm, or whatever factor.
It's interesting, when the Senate has a ceremonial session in the old Senate chamber, members come into that old chamber that was used until 1859, and they just instinctively sit on their assigned sides in the as they would be in the current chamber, and then they kind of catch themselves, and they kind of look a little bit nervous, a little bit embarrassed, and maybe some of them will actually cross over and Republicans sit on the Democratic side, but there's a lot of pressure against doing that. In the very early days of the Senate, there was no party seating. That developed pretty much in the 1840s as parties coalesced in the Senate. I think that would probably be at the bottom of a list of recommendations. But what they're talking about is, one recommendation recently was that they could have lunch together. Just as the two parties have lunch every Tuesday as a group, then maybe once a month get them all together. And who knows how that would work. So I think the attendance might be kind of low, but you don't know. So.
We have time for one last question if anybody wants to raise their hand real fast. Otherwise, I'm going to ask it. Okay, I'm going to.
There you go.
Okay, and I'll ask one too, but I need to get a microphone right here. Right here.
Explain the procedure that Senator Bunning is using right now that requires only one person to stop everything.
Well, the Senate operates under unanimous consent because of the way the rules are structured. To short-circuit the rules and avoid a lot of unnecessary hard feelings and delay. And this gets back to the question of the job of the majority leader and the minority leader, to organize, to propound these unanimous consent agreements, whether it's as simple as we're going to have a vote at 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon to something a lot more complex. And they spend hours and a lot of staff involvement. And so the leader goes in, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to do X. Unanimous consent. And all of a sudden, in the back of the Senate chamber, you hear the two most fateful words any senator can utter: I object. And that's what is going on here. It's perfectly within the rights of a senator to do that. And to the great credit of the majority and minority leaders, they try to keep that to a minimum if they can through a lot of personal consultation and maybe a little back scratching here and there. But every once in a while, particularly in contentious times, it happens, and that's the Senate.
Tell everyone about the Senate Hall of Fame and how that got started under then Senator Jack Kennedy, and kind of some of the guidelines for how the senators in the Hall of Fame were selected.
In 1955, Lyndon Johnson, as majority leader, thought that it was in the middle of the Cold War, senators were kind of grumpy, and they needed to feel a little bit better about being in the United States Senate. Out just off the Senate chamber is a room called the reception room. And although it's grandly decorated on the ceiling by the Italian fresco artist Constantino Bermidi at the time of the Civil War, there were 5 medallion portrait spaces left vacant. And so LBJ came up with the idea, let's select 5 outstanding former senators, no longer living, who could serve as role models to current senators, and maybe make everybody proud of their being a senator, or at least have ideals to aspire to in human form. Then LBJ suffered a heart attack in the summer of 1955, and so he couldn't chair this committee to make the selections, and so it fell to John F. Kennedy, a relatively junior senator who was in the middle of writing his book Profiles in Courage, about 8 courageous senators. So Kennedy became the chair of the committee, but then the other 4 members were much more senior than he, and they brought in a group of 160 academics, including former President Harry Truman, to send in their lists of outstanding senators. And they had I think the list had about 68 major senators, and they only could select 5. And they finally did boil it down to Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun. That was kind of no-brainer. But for the 20th century, this is 1955, 2 slots for the 20th century. George Norris of Nebraska, the great progressive Republican, father of TVA and a lot of other progressive legislation, got the most votes from the outside panel. But the 2 senators from Nebraska, Roman Ruska and Carl Curtis, were determined that this progressive predecessor was never going to grace the walls of the United States Senate in any kind of a hall of fame whatsoever. And so so they said, all right, we agree this would be a unanimous decision. So they instead selected Robert La Follette, Sr. of Wisconsin, which was also a good choice in terms of a progressive senator. And then Robert Taft of Ohio, Sr., who recently died, had been the Republican leader for a very short time, and had been in the Senate in a leadership role for quite a while. And that was it. And then in 1999, Majority Leader Trent Lott looked around that room and he saw some other empty spaces. And so instead of bringing in all the outside consultants, the Senate Historical Office kind of played that role. And we used a list of sort of also-rans from the 1950s competition, and they ended up with one Republican and one Democrat. Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, the Republican, and Robert Wagner of New York as the Democrat. Again, sort of New Deal era, World War II era senators. But there were more spaces available on the wall there. And so that's for future generations to decide. But it was a good exercise in saying, what do you mean by outstanding? These don't have to be the absolute best senators, because no one would ever agree what best is. But outstanding. Why do they deserve this credit? And so there they are in the Senate reception room, hopefully inspiring senators as they come and go in their daily work.
Richard, thanks for a great evening. We really appreciate you being with us here at the Dole Institute.
Thank you. Big honor. Thank you. Thank you very much.